Nerd morning, everyone. My name is Jeremy Miller, and I am here with my brother John, and
I
we are going to talk today about some of our speculations and thoughts of the upcoming game Breath of the Wild 2, and some of the stuff that's come out, and some of the things we'd like to see. So first off, I think one of the big things that we've got to realize when talking about Breath of the Wild 2 is that it is a direct sequel to Breath of the Wild. And that's really, really rare for the Zelda franchise. A lot of them are so unrelated that they're like different timelines and completely different eras.
Even the other direct sequels, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, for example. Majora's Mask, completely new map. The main thing that relates the two is the Ocarina itself. In Wind Waker, you get a direct sequel in the game Phantom Hourglass, but again, completely new map, completely almost unrelated story. The only thing is you're rescuing the same Zelda and Tetra, the pirate, and that's the connection.
Yeah, I think so. That's really interesting because with Breath of the Wild 2, obviously that's not going to be its name. That's just the best thing that we can use to describe it and what other people have used to describe it because we just don't have a name yet. It's too early. But from what we understand, it is going to be a direct sequel. We're probably going to be in a similar, if not to the same map as Breath of the Wild. Obviously, with some changes, updates, things like that. But this is going to be something that's very tied into that. I think like when you had mentioned, from Ocarina of Time versus Majora's Mask, and we can see how he's off looking for Navi or trying to go on this like kind of this side adventure on his own. That doesn't necessarily directly connect, but you can see how this matches in the timeline. But other than that, it really doesn't connect.
Yeah, exactly. In this one, we have the same Link, the same Zelda, and the same world. Shortly after, they're probably rebuilding, they're discovering new threats, new evils, and they're all related to the same old threat of Calamity Ganon that they were fighting beforehand. This is going to be the most sequel of any Zelda.
Yeah. So, inside of the trailer, which you guys can definitely check out on YouTube, they have like this teaser clip. We see a skeleton that mostly we're basically assuming is like like I think
This is zombified Ganondorf.
yeah, and so I think like Ganondorf as Ganondorf. When I think of that, I think of Ocarina of Time. You think that this is the Ganondorf that was slain inside of that? Do you think it's going to be also like Twilight Princess?
I very much think it's the Twilight Princess Ganondorf because the exact way he's dead, he basically looks like he has a big hole in his chest right where he was stabbed twice, in fact, and uh, it's probably the same Ocarina of Time Ganondorf who later became the Twilight Ganondorf, who is now going to be Breath of the Wild 2 zombified Ganondorf.
Yeah, so I think that's interesting. That I think that's really helpful because we're gonna see how this has the potential to have little tie-ins and links from other games and other parts of this epic journey that we've had as Zelda fans. And I think one of the things that I would love to see more inside of the Breath of the Wild 2 is more direct references because like we have this how this Ganondorf can directly potentially link to another game. I think that one of the things that Breath of the Wild did, which was amazing and they did a really cool job with, is that it had references like Tingle Island and other type of structures that you're like, oh, that's from this game, but like obviously Tingle Island isn't Tingle, and we see like Beetle and other characters, though they're like 1,000 years different, just like the lives of Zelda and Link are kind of like reincarnated. We see now these other characters like Beetle, which has been inside of the Breath of the Wild, but other characters like Tingle in other games
Mm-hmm.
that we didn't get at all but have existed in other versions. And I would like to see some less subtle references or more of these characters' reincarnated existences inside of Breath of the Wild 2 that we just didn't get inside of Breath of the Wild.
It would be very fun to see a lot of that. All throughout the map, you have little places like a little ruin called Maybe Village, which is referencing the village from Link's Awakening. You have the ruins of the ranch from Ocarina of Time that you can run around and explore. But it would be nice to see elements that were important to these other stories, perhaps even start tying in more so.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, like, not to downplay what Breath of the Wild did, because that was a really cool and clever way to talk about and reference all of this, like, volumes and volumes worth of, like, history and material in a very clever way. So I'm really, like, applaud Breath of the Wild for how they did those types of things, and I would just love to see them be a little less subtle and us to be able to have more of the immersion inside of those things instead of just kind of like side touches on some of those ideas. I think that that'd be a really cool thing to see. And I think another thing that we really are gonna like it's gonna be interesting to see is, like, obviously the shrines, their purpose have been pretty much fulfilled, and whether or not the different shrines exist, we're not going to interact with them in the same way. And I think a lot of people want to see something a little bit different when it comes to those, like, dungeon type elements inside of Breath of the Wild 2.
Yeah, I think one of the fans' most requested features for Breath of the Wild 2 is one of my most requested features too, is kind of a return to the classic Zelda temples. The little bit larger dungeons that you spend time in, you have several puzzles to figure out. While the Divine Beasts, their puzzles kind of were the dungeons of Breath of the Wild, they still felt kind of medium-sized at best. And some of the players who've been playing Zelda for a long time were kind of still wanting more by the time they were done with it.
I think that's something, like, totally legitimate. I think with the open canvas that we have of an open world game and being able to go to all these different places, I think that that is super, super awesome. And with that, they had to respond by shrinking some of those dungeons, or else the game would have just been too big. Like, just for gameplay, it would have just been too expansive. And so they had these smaller dungeons. There was like 120 of these on the base level shrines, and that worked really, really well. But as a gamer of particularly Zelda, I think Ocarina of Time was my first video game to complete from beginning to end, maybe outside of, like, the Pokemon games. Like, this was sitting down with a full console system. That was my first game, and I loved the temples minus the water temple. I still hate that temple, but
It's tough, but I love it.
but that's, like, such a, I think, a pivotal part of what Zelda games have been since, even like with Link's Awakening. You would go in, you would go through these dungeons, you'd come out with something, and that equipped you to go forward in the game. And in the Breath of the Wild, they gave you all of the tools that you needed, really, to go up if you were a crazy person and battle Ganon right there.
With
which
a mop.
Which is, like, amazing, and I'm so glad that people have made videos about that, and I'm just like, that's just not me as a gamer.
If you can do that, good for you.
Right? But I love the idea of these big temples, big dungeons, and I think that as we see this civilization develop outside of a calamity, a post-apocalyptic world, now that they've defeated Ganon inside of Breath of the Wild, that we're able to see some progress and maybe open up some of these temples or other mysteries that we didn't even really get to reach inside of the game of Breath of the Wild 2.
Yeah, definitely. Particularly that now that Calamity Ganon has been defeated, I'm not sure what the difference between Calamity Ganon and Ganondorf Ganon is. Perhaps Calamity Ganon was more of the spirit of demise, while we get to fight actual villain Ganondorf now. I'm not sure. But anyways, there was no blood moons, which means monsters that die probably tend to stay dead. I'm imagining that people now have a chance to kind of expand, to rebuild things that they were beaten back for hundreds of years, 100 years, sorry, that they just couldn't do, and now we get to see, like, Hyrule being rebuilt a little bit would be amazing to see.
Yeah, I totally agree because Breath of the Wild, like it's supposed to be wild and fields and grass and hills and mountains and climbing on rocks except if it's raining, and some of these really cool elements that were about the nature and the beauty of exploring. And I think we're now able to get that and keep that and then just put in more cities, more people, like things that are growing out of what we had, and as the civilization's able to breathe and develop and grow, that we're going to be able to have some of those type of elements inside of the next game that I think will be maybe less on the wild, but maybe more on the Hyrule Kingdom. And I think that would be really cool to see more of the kingdom of Hyrule under the leadership of their Princess Zelda and having the Hero of Ages there and present and competent because he's done this great task already.
Yeah, so obviously for Breath of the Wild 2, something's going to go wrong. But before that, it would be wonderful to see a little bit of civilization come back. It can even be a little subtle, kind of like we got to build Terrytown in Breath of the Wild 1, which was...
That was super cool.
It was a super cool, almost like building up a Wild West town little experience. You had to chop a million trees to do it, but...
Oh my goodness, so many trees.
But it was fantastic to see kind of this little hill rock thing in the middle of a lake in Akala become this full-fledged little village that you were the one who really helped build it. And that was probably the most fulfilling side quest in the entire game.
Totally. And I think, like, there were a ton of different side quests, taking pictures of different things, acquiring certain weapons and showing a little kid, which is kind of marginally, like, maybe not the best idea. But there was a lot of different quests, and I think that there's some really fun things there. But what would you like to see more from some of those type of quests or adventures inside of this next game?
Well, Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask was probably my favorite game, actually probably of all time, because everything you did for the NPCs felt super rewarding. You really felt like you helped their life be a million times better, and you felt like the rewards meant something to you. So, in Breath of the Wild, usually you get a million weapons and you show a little kid for a couple rupees that you're like, great, I could have grabbed 5 apples off that tree and sold it for the same amount.
Yeah. I think, like, Majora's Mask is an interesting comparison. Nintendo has talked about Breath of the Wild 2 in terms of Majora's Mask. And it's like, I don't know, like, in your side quests, one of the things we were able to see is how their lives were different by doing some of those quests, because you go back and you start again, and you go back and you start again. And so if you fulfill certain quests, you're like, oh wow, my life is so much better. And then you go back and you see them again, but you didn't fulfill the quest. You're like, oh, my life is horrible, and all these things are going wrong. And you can see the difference. And I don't know if there's necessarily an easy way in a linear story to show that, other than seeing, like, different, like, development. When we built that town and chopped all those trees, we saw a legitimate difference when we came back. And I think it'd be cool to see some of that going on. But obviously, even beyond all that development, we're going to have something majorly go wrong, which it looks like waking up zombie Ganondorf. And that's going to make some big differences in the game. Kind of, what do you see going on here to see how the story or quest is going to move forward?
Obviously the map is going to be similar, but it has to be different in some ways because it's a new game. You have to have a little bit more of that wonder and exploration. This is speculation, of course, but when you wake up Zombie Ganon, it seems like Hyrule Castle's Sheikah technology underneath it kind of lifts it up in the air, almost like a flying divine beast kind of magic thing. And I imagine that there's going to be repercussions all around, perhaps earthquakes, other things, open up new dungeons. Perhaps some areas that we had seen in Breath of the Wild, like the Forgotten Temple, could maybe open up an actual dungeon that we get to explore that might be important. There's various locations that you could tie in so many things, kind of like we were saying, references to other games, like perhaps the Spirit Springs, and you could make them very important to kind of go back to the roots to help solve this new dilemma.
So I like that. I think that's a really cool idea that some of these like ancient, like relic, like shrine like locations that opened up to a shrine could now necessarily open up to a temple, and we could go on from there. I think some of the things that I really love about Breath of the Wild that were totally unique, I'd like to see continue inside of Breath of the Wild 2. Like, we don't really have an XP leveling up mechanic in this game. But like history of Zelda, we have this heart container growth. And they built in a stamina type thing, which is kind of comparable to the magic wheel, but
A little bit.
a little bit different, obviously.
Physical instead of magic traits, but...
Yeah. And our magic traits were technology. But they're really magic, but it's technology. And that's okay. That's totally fine.
The Sheikah Slate's magic.
Right?
Sorry.
It just is. But like, there's some of those mechanics I really like. I like that we had weapons that broke, and we were able to continue to acquire them. I thought initially I was going to hate that. But I thought it was really fun because I was able to acquire what I needed. That I think is really, really important.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to kind of upgrade and do different things with those as I fought bigger and badder baddies. I was able to go and get cooler armor and cooler other things that were kind of like leveling up, but not really. I liked that mechanic. I would like to see that Zelda continues to have that type of mechanic that they've really had since since the beginning of the games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I particularly like kind of how you put it, is kind of the way that Link levels up is getting more hearts, getting better gear. It feels very natural, and also a classic in Zelda, you can avoid picking up things like heart pieces or some of the better gear if you wanted to have harder experience, and you had total freedom of play there.
Crazy people.
Gandorf with Mop.
Right? I think that all that freedom is totally possible, and I think that makes really cool opportunities to expand, try different things, and I think that was the coolest aspect of Breath of the Wild, was after beating the game, going and looking on videos and saying, look, this is a way that people designed things that you could levitate or fly or use the mechanics of the game to like launch yourself into the air and do all these really cool aspects that were maybe intended, maybe not intended. But the thing is there was just so much freedom. That was such a desirable trait, and I'd love to see Breath of the Wild 2 have that. I definitely think that Nintendo has that in mind.
Yeah, especially since the way they made the first game, Breath of the Wild, they built it all around that freedom of exploration. With Breath of the Wild 2, they can still incorporate lots of ideas from that, even if they have maybe one or two more linear story elements. They can still have total freedom of exploration and total freedom of where you go, what you do. I mean, the ability to basically climb up a mountainside, any mountainside, almost every surface in the game was climbable. So much more than Uncharted, Assassin's Creed, anything else. You could just shimmy your way up anything almost. You could go, you see a mountain in the distance, you can go there. It was brilliant.
And you're like, I'm going to climb up the wall of this castle. And you're like, I'm going to climb to the very top spire to try to see what's there. And I really liked the Korok quest in the fact that I was like, I'm gonna climb to the top of that thing, and I got a reward. Almost every place that I was just like, there's got to be something there. There was, and they mapped that out. I thought in an amazing way. I mean, they did that by making a bazillion Koroks available.
Yeah.
But they gave you rewards to explore. One of the things that I really kind of uh, like in some of the older iterations of Zelda is that they gave you essential items that opened up the door for more gameplay. And they did that through a lot of the dungeons where they would have, your basic grappling
Hook shot.
and then you had like the bigger hook shot. And you had some of these upgradable type things and different tools that made it so the world was a little bit more explorable. And I think it'd be really cool to see some of those types of things added in. I think that would add a lot to what we're capable to do and for the gameplay.
Hookshot is actually an interesting mention. Did you know that it was originally planned for Breath of the Wild, but they took it out because they thought it made exploration and climbing a little too easy?
That's interesting. Yeah, because since you can climb practically any surface, you're like, you wouldn't have to maybe necessarily do that. And it affects the elements of stamina. Because if you have less stamina, but all of a sudden you have hookshot, you don't have to have the same amount of stamina to get the job done. And I think if they were to explore some of the different mechanics and made it so, in essence, you could explore everywhere, right? But now there are certain things that would be unlockable if you got different tools, and then you were able to return to those places and have more there to do. I think that would be a really cool way to make the world seem even bigger than it already is, which is already huge. And I don't know what they're necessarily going to do when it comes to those types of elements, but I think that'd be an interesting thing to call back some of the valuable gameplay elements that they've seen in previous games without surrendering, I think, some of the huge progress that they've made into what games can be. Mm-hmm. Because this game was so progressive, I think, in what open worlds are allowed to be able to be and what Zelda itself, the franchise, is able to be moving forward.
Yeah, I agree. I would also like to see maybe some return to some items that you find in the dungeons that help you out a lot and you get a keep. And I like it pretty much what you said is what you're saying is a good blending of kind of the old and the new mechanics and trying to make something that perfectly marries the two of them together. And that could have a lot of potential for Breath of the Wild 2 for sure.
Yeah. Obviously, this topic is huge. There is so much that we could talk about. Just for sake of time, we've already made this video pretty substantial. We're going to kind of cut things off here. And I'd love for you guys to share what are the things you want to see outside of Breath of the Wild 2. What were some of your favorite elements of Breath of the Wild? And what do you guys see Nintendo doing with the franchise moving forward that you guys are excited about, frightened about, or just different thoughts that you guys have about some of these topics that we had discussed. So make sure to put those in the comments. Love to hear you guys' thoughts. And thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to like and also to subscribe. Also find my Nerd Morning on other type of platforms, and as well, John is an artist. I'll make sure to drop down his art link on the description as well. So thank you guys so much for following along.
Okay, thank you.